Joined with me in the inaugural episode of What the Hekmat is Zaid Jilani, a renowned journalist in my world as a Substack writer for Inquire, your own Substack. Previously with The Intercept, you've written a lot. You were colleagues with greats in their career, such as Glenn Greenwald. You are part of the advisory board for FAIR, and you have previously worked also for the Center for American Progress. Zed, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I think that was actually a pretty good summary. I've spent most of the past, I'd say around a dozen years, working in the nonprofit advocacy space or working as actually a journalist. So that includes the think tanks like Center for American Progress. I work for a political action committee called the Progressive Change Campaign Committee. I've worked for political campaigns, but also I've worked as a journalist, putting on a different hat, which is just writing and reporting about the world. Largely politics, meaning DC and state and local elections and government legislation, but also some more social issue and cultural issue stuff as well, which I'm doing a lot more of lately, I'd say, over the past few years. So,
And how do you feel about your recent switch into your own writing, your independent journalism that you're doing on Substack?
yeah, I mean, it's an interesting experience because I think that when I was working full time as a journalist, as a reporter, I was doing all writing, reporting, which I still do a fair bit of now on my Substack, and also when I do freelance articles for various outlets. But I've done more like opinion and analysis stuff, which I think is putting on a different hat because I have mostly just stuck to reporting over the past so such and such period of years. But it's interesting to dive back into that because I feel like the Substack is almost like it's bringing back like old school blogging. Because I used to read a lot of blogs when I was younger, like in early 2000s, and I was a regular reader, I think, of a lot of blogs. And so it's interesting for me to kind of go back into kind of that space and have that format where you're writing posts about topical things, going back and forth, having comments, so on and so forth.
I have been thinking about that actually. The prior generations' blogs has now become listicles on Twitter threads, just notable figures who summarize an entire concept in 4 or 5 consecutive tweets. So yeah, I appreciate your Substack for sure. I recommend people follow it. So really quickly, last question about your background. What is your academic background and how did you end up with journalism? Also, what is your age? I have no clue.
Yeah. Those are all good questions. So I went to the University of Georgia because I'm born and raised outside of Atlanta in Georgia. So I went to University of Georgia for my undergraduate education. I majored in international affairs with a minor in Arabic. And I did that in 3 years. It was 2006, 2009. And after I graduated, basically I looked at the skill set that I had, what I had been doing in college. And a lot of what I had been doing in college, in addition to my studies, was I wrote for the campus newspaper, the Red and Black, the official newspaper. And I also started a student magazine that I just worked with some friends on. So I came to understand that like one of my skill sets was writing, doing reporting, and so on and so forth. So I took a job actually at the Center for American Progress, which was mentioned earlier, which is a think tank. But I worked at the unit called Think Progress, which was a blog basically, writing basically short form stories about different topics. And so I wrote for the blog, and also I helped manage and edit the newsletter, which we had like a daily newsletter around to, I don't know, 70,000 people or something like that. And so it was really a kind of a quick pivot between being in the academic space and then actually getting involved in like the news cycle and actually writing about contemporary debates that were happening in DC. At that time, I think right when I started in 2009, so it was largely healthcare. I did a lot of healthcare stuff because the Affordable Care Act was being debated at that point. But from then, I just kind of hit the ground running and had, I think, a series of opportunities or jobs where I did similar stuff, either working in the kind of communications roles and advocacy organizations, or then later working for publications as a reporter.
Excellent. Good to know. All right. Well, the reason I have you on today is because I really like your form of journalism. I like the writing that you do on Twitter, and I think you're someone who and I get you, and I'm sure you get this all the time, but I think you're someone who speaks their mind, not towing the line between left and right. You're someone who describes themselves as center left leaning. I think just by the mere fact that you speak your mind and you don't sugarcoat any of your opinions, people hesitate to place you on the left. If you want to talk a little bit about that, see how in the last 4 years you'd say the perception of your political leaning has changed in the minds of people. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question because I think when you place a political label on yourself or a grouping, it comes with a lot of assumptions. So people, I think, okay, if you're on the right, you say not only do you say certain things, you believe certain things, but you say them a certain way. Maybe you read a certain group of people, you associate with a group of people. If you're on the left, the same way in the other direction, right? I think of it in a more classical sense, which is like if you take a political compass test, it asks you about all kinds of social and political topics. You do the test, and the test places you somewhere on the spectrum. So yeah, there's obviously not just one political compass test. There's many. But generally, when I take them, what you mentioned was the kind of territory that I end up. And I think that's actually stayed pretty consistent. I think what maybe has changed perceptions a little bit is because I think some people think that where you are on the political spectrum is defined by what you're against, and like how vigorous and sort of insistent you are about that. So I think, an example would be like in 2004, Howard Dean was the governor of Vermont. He ran for president on the Democratic side. He was seen as very, very liberal. And I think part of the reason he was seen as so liberal is just because he was very adamant against George Bush. He was very critical of him, so on and so forth. So he was seen as the most liberal candidate for many reasons. Even though some other candidates that weren't seen maybe as quite as liberal, they might have actually believed things that were more progressive than he did. I mean, he actually had a reputation in Vermont as being a more moderate governor compared to a lot of the liberal people in Vermont. But now I think that's everywhere. I think a lot of people think I'm a very good liberal because every day I can go online, denounce any number of conservative people, thoughts, ideas, things. Or I'm a very good conservative because today I really own those libs or something like they have these counter-dependent identities, right? And I don't necessarily think that to be a healthy way to think. But I think when some people see when I kind of turn down the opportunity to do that, that means, oh, I'm not there, so maybe that explains some of the perception or some of the ways that people are thinking about that. It doesn't necessarily impact me because I don't define myself as against someone else or something. So
yeah. So I hope to establish for my listeners and viewers that you're someone that I consider you'll say the facts as they are. You've been on Rising, you've been on Breaking Points, you've been on a lot of places both on left and right, Timcast. You've worked with Faisal Shakir, Bernie's campaign manager. You've been everywhere. So I trust that you're going to give us your true unbiased opinion on the topic of this first episode, which is the movie Don't Look Up. And the reason I think someone's opinion like yours is very important because there are two sides of this coin. People either are fawning over it and saying that this is the best movie ever made since Casablanca, or some others are saying that this is a disgusting movie that has no value and should not be seen by anyone unless you pirate it on some sketchy Tor website. So I have points here that I want to address with you, but first, can you give me broad general ideas after you watched the movie and what your opinion was on it?
Yeah. So Don't Look Up. So it's streaming on Netflix. I imagine some theaters probably ran it just because you have to do that to be an awards consideration. So maybe some small theaters in a few cities that probably also run, but most people I think are watching it on Netflix. So I also watched it on Netflix. I think I was on a trip or something, like a plane trip. And so I downloaded it onto my phone from Netflix and I watched it on the airplane. And for me, I did find it to be entertaining. Like I found it to actually be worth watching. It was kind of fun. I think that a lot of the acting reminded me a lot of an improv set. Improv comedy is something I used to do a lot in DC before the pandemic when we could gather more. And the thing about improv is you focus a lot on making like characters and like making strong emotional choices with them. And I felt like the sequence of events in the film were kind of based on that, right? And that they introduced characters who I think were almost a little overacted and that they were big zany kind of caricatures of various parts of society, and they just kind of had them play with each other and advance the plot along more than thinking about maybe a larger sweep or stretch of a story. So in that way, I think it was kind of a fun movie to watch and conceptualizing it that way. I think some people were critical of some of the roles, like, is Leonardo DiCaprio really, could he really be a nerd? You know, he's considered to be a very attractive, charismatic
No one
actor.
believed
But,
it.
you know, yeah, you know, some people I think were critical of that, but I found him to be entertaining in the role. And I do think that almost at times also it's also very sincere, and at times it's even touching. I think some of the scenes in the film, in terms of the emphasis on sort of the smaller subplots, like the subplot about Leonardo DiCaprio's character's relationship with his family, for instance. I think at times it was touching. But that being said, I think that some of the political points that the film was trying to make didn't quite land, because I think that the satire that they had presented and put together was just too far from reality in some points. Like, of course, satire is never supposed to completely match reality, right? It's supposed to be somewhat of an exaggeration. Generally has a more absurd spin or comical spin. Famous satires include films like Dr. Strangelove, which of course was satirizing the nuclear arrangement between the United States and Soviet Union. Other recent satirical films that are really good. I don't know if your listeners or viewers have seen any of Armando Iannucci's stuff, which is like, he makes Beep, which is, I think, is a very entertaining show. Julia Louis-Dreyfus. Yeah, Veep. And he also makes a series of British programs which satirize British politics. But I think there's some really good satires out there. But with this film, my perception was that while it was a fun and entertaining movie, it at times was just too absurd to be like an accurate satire, right? Like, it wasn't making the kind of the most realistic or correct critiques of a lot of the institutions that it was satirizing. Yeah. And I think the one that I felt, the part of it that I felt most strongly about was the way they presented the news media, because basically the first half of the movie, or maybe first third of the movie, you see Leonardo DiCaprio's character, and he's a scientist. I think he must be an astronomer or something similar to that, because he helps as a professor at a university. He is tasked with, it must be some kind of survey system.
Yeah, he's identifying. Yeah, a physicist identifying objects extraterrestrially that could potentially.
Yeah, they have a telescope basically at this university, and so he and his assistant, who I think is a PhD student, who is played by Jennifer Lawrence.
Yeah.
Basically, what happens is they discover a comet heading towards the Earth, and basically in 6 months.
By the way.
Spoiler. Yeah, I guess it's a spoiler, but it's like the first 5 minutes of the movie, so we didn't spoil it too bad. Yeah, so they discover a comet's coming, and so they run around trying to get everyone to do something about this. And what they find is that a lot of people are just disinterested about it, right? And the one institution where I really felt like the critique was just off the mark was the news media, because I can't imagine, having worked in news media, having written or appeared on all kinds of mainstream media, been involved with publications left and right, it's just very hard for me to imagine that the news media would be disinterested in like a large scale catastrophe of any sort, right?
There's I believe the actual quote was, "We like to keep it light here," on the program of the RIP, but they So I don't know how, in what scenario that could be even slightly believable.
No, the thing is, I think that there were two news organizations in particular they based the satire off of. You could kind of tell by like the format of the show and like the font they were using for the publication, but I think they were satirizing the New York Times and Morning Joe. And Morning Joe's a morning MSNBC morning program. And the New York Times, of course, is like a paper of record based in New York City, but has a global presence. And I would imagine that both of those programs, if both of those publications and organizations, if there was a comet heading towards the Earth, I think it would be seen as a gold mine for their productions, right? They would be covering every single angle of that. They'd be pressing politicians about that. They'd be interviewing scientists every day about it. There'd probably be a hologram on the screen of the comet as it approaches the Earth, giving us the exact date and time it's going to hit. That to me is the most realistic way that I could see the news media responding to this. And it would almost have been more entertaining if they had satirized it in that sense, right? To have like, Don Lemon with his comet hologram, maybe interviewing some people who have built a comet shelter because they think it'll protect them from the comet. Like, there's the news media tends to have a bias towards negativity and sensationalism, right? It doesn't tend to have a negativity towards, everything is going to be okay, everything's awesome. We like to keep it light, as you said, right?
Yeah.
So they got the bias backwards. And I think that kind of just set the entire film kind of on the wrong direction in the critique, because even some of their political critiques, like, they had some critiques that had some truth to it. Like, they suggested that, large donors are very persuasive over president and politicians, and that there's certainly some truth to that. They suggested that, not everyone who's in the White House is necessarily the brightest mind in the world, not the most competent people. I think all that's true, but it was all kind of predicated on the news media kind of letting the comet story go, and then the world just not being that concerned about it. And I just don't think that's how it would play out. And I think we have a kind of a test scenario on that, which was the COVID-19 pandemic, which is, with the COVID-19 pandemic, there certainly were divergent responses to it among society, including on political lines. But it wasn't a matter of no one significant like denied that there was a COVID-19 pandemic happening. No one significant suggested that we should just shrug and like forget about it. I mean, that was a very marginal sentiment at most, right?
Yeah.
I can totally believe that there would be like a polarized response to a comet heading towards the Earth. Maybe the parties would blame each other for not doing enough or not doing the right thing about it. But the idea that we would just ignore it and shrug our shoulders and, go watch some celebrity videos or something, I imagine it'd be one of the more terrifying and I think terrifying and just sort of chaotic environments everywhere in the United States and the rest of the world. And I just don't think, I don't think their central critique was right in the satire, even though I think the movie was pretty entertaining. And they did make a few good points about the political system and so on and so forth. And it's disappointing to me also just because, like, I don't know how big of a role he played in it, but David Sirota, who was a political journalist who also worked for Bernie Sanders, both when he was a congressman back in the day and also most recently in a presidential campaign. And I've worked with David in the past. I've co-written some things with him. I think he's a really smart guy. He knows the media very well. And I don't know, maybe it was more of an Adam McKay thing, because McKay has not worked in political media, so maybe he doesn't know as much about it. He was the director of the film. He probably did more of the writing than Sirota did. But yeah, I would, I am sympathetic to some of Sirota's critiques of the media that he makes at times, but those just didn't really translate into this film, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic as well, and I really appreciate Crystal Ball's opinions on the matter. And I that's the reason I watched it the day it released, because I was watching Breaking Points and I saw their segment with David Sirota, and my expectations were much higher than what I actually saw on TV. So yeah, it wasn't coming from a perspective that you think is well versed with the media, well versed with how things actually work in Washington, D.C. Which brings me to the other follow-up question here. There are a bunch of stereotypes made in the movie about the two political parties. One of them was certainly less revealing of the current times. When I saw it, I just remembered good old movies made in 2005, 2008, mimicking the baboonery, if you may, of like the Bushes, or mimicking the hand-holding, strong-holding ways of Ronald Reagan. So when I saw Meryl Streep's character, I kind of was disappointed. I expected something more nuanced about a conservative president, something that would speak to today's populist side, potentially, of conservatism. I didn't expect to see this, cigarette in hand type president that just was bossing people around, not paying attention to anything that was going around them. So, what were your thoughts about the Meryl Streep character and how it purely shows one side of the aisle depicted within her?
Yeah, I mean, my perception was that she was a conservative president, even though they didn't explicitly, I don't think throughout the movie they explicitly used the labels like Republican or Democrat.
No, but she's wearing red in most of her scenes.
Right. Not only is she wearing red, but like her supporters at rallies and stuff, when they have their signs, The signs are like obviously like Trump font or like
And they had
Republican
the red
Party monitor.
hats on and everything.
Right. Like they're and also like her chief of staff is her son,
Hmm.
which is supposed to be an allusion to Jared Kushner, I think. He's Trump's son-in-law.
Yeah, and
He wasn't
Ivanka
chief of
as
staff,
well.
but he was fairly senior. Right.
Hmm.
And so I think that it was obviously an allusion to a conservative president, but I think some people I know who watched the movie and were commenting about it, I think they saw a bit of Hillary Clinton in her as well, but I didn't really see that as much.
And
Maybe they just because she's a woman, maybe they thought she was like Hillary Clinton, because everything I've heard about Hillary Clinton is that Hillary Clinton is very visceral in person, or like she's very
yeah,
detail oriented, and like she's like really smart. Like
yeah, she's not gonna be doing the same
it
stuff
didn't
about.
match her. It didn't match her personality at all. So I
Not at
didn't
all.
think it
Yeah,
was Hillary
agreed.
Clinton. But yeah, I do think it was largely a critique of conservative politicians.
Mm.
And you're right in the sense that this particular critique has really been made. I think it was most mainstream under George W. Bush,
Hmm.
because George W. Bush, the critique towards him was always that he was someone of a simpleton.
Hmm.
I had a professor who knew him during college at
Yeah.
Yale. And even my professor told me, yeah, when he was at the lunch table during lunch, he couldn't keep up with our conversations. Like, even like college George W. Bush people he had a
He was a bit
reputation for not being
slow.
very smart. Yeah, like that was, and to me that felt like the same thing was going with Meryl Streep's president, because the central critique of her basically was that she just wasn't very bright, wasn't taking it very seriously, didn't know what was going on. Um, and it's interesting when I'm thinking back to Sirota. I remember Sirota. I think he's written about this actually somewhere. And that like one of his favorite political satires is Idiocracy. And Idiocracy is a movie that basically suggests that like America's central problem will be that it's like people are really dumb. Like we can't do anything. We're kind of incompetent. And I'm trying to think if I've ever even seen the entire movie Idiocracy. I feel like I've seen parts of it. But I think that a lot of that made it into this movie. Like a lot of David's appreciation for Idiocracy made it into this film, because the central problem with all the characters is just that they are like really, really, really dumb. Like, it isn't even
Dumb
that they're
or
like
self-indulged in some way or
there
another.
there
Yeah.
is there is a little bit of like greed in it, but even the greed is not the biggest thing, because like like
It's not convincing greed.
you have to be very dumb to take the risk that they were taking, and you have to be very
Yeah.
dumb to be dismissive of something like this, right?
Yeah.
You can be the most selfish person on earth, but if you're intelligent, you would have known what to do in this situation, or you would have behaved with more wisdom in this situation, right? And
So,
I think in terms of the side of the movie that's the political critique,
mm,
um, that's also a little bit harder of a sell, right? To suggest
yeah.
that, I think Ross Dout had actually, he tweeted this, he's a New York Times columnist. He tweeted that like, at the end of the day, if if the conservative president just made a different decision, the whole movie would have like been over, and like everything would have been solved instantly, right? Like
Yeah.
it wasn't as much as McKay and Sirota maybe thought they were making a larger social critique. Um,
Like
it
the
did kind
option
of come
was within
down,
our hands. There
right,
was a solution.
right,
It was all there. It's just
right.
one
The
dumb institution that just decided not to do anything about it.
Right. Like it really just kind of falls to like this actually could have been handled very easily, right? Which also, we should note that this film is intended to be a critique of like the human approach to global warming or climate change,
Climate
right?
change. Yeah.
They're suggesting that like we are ignoring this threat, this ominous threat, and nobody cares enough about it. And there's scenes where Leo's character is like yelling at the screen, trying to get people to take it seriously.
Hmm.
And I think the big difference between this and that is that if a comet's heading towards the Earth, there's basically one response, which is using some type of weapons to deflect it or destroy it.
Yep.
And I think every country in the world would just be putting their resources to doing that, and they would do it. Tackling global warming, I'm not a climate science expert. Out of all the topics I've written about, reported about, I've probably done the least on the environment. I've done a little bit, but not that much. So I'm not an expert by any means. But I think that the central problem with it is that it's actually a very difficult challenge to orient our economies in an entirely different way, to orient the way we live in an entirely different way. And I think Slaughter would probably be right if he argued that like political corruption was making it more difficult to tackle that. Any number of things are making it more difficult to tackle it, but still a hard, like much, much harder problem than the comet. And going back to Ross Douthat's point, if it was just a matter of a single leader just doing something more intelligently, you can take down a social problem pretty easily. And this one is just, it requires the cooperation of 100 plus countries, industry, because huge changes to consumer lifestyle at times, governments. It's actually very difficult. And it also kind of makes the comet and global warming analogies that are kind of difficult for me to kind of put together. Not that I necessarily have a better idea for how you would satirize the global warming problems, because it's a difficult problem to tackle. But the comet just, it was hard for me to connect the two things when they're on entirely different scales in terms of how easy it is or how obvious the solution is to the problem.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It seems like it missed the mark generationally, the movie.
Mhm.
And then when it tried to be serious, it was already in the Talladega Nights territory from
Right.
the directing and the movie perspective. So it wasn't able to get to the seriousness that it espoused, even with the dramatic final scenes where everyone's holding hands and praying together. So that brings me to another point that I think they missed the mark, is that they introduced this billionaire who's the head of the CEO of this company called Bash. And I think they try and portray someone of a Jeff Musk, so Bezos, Elon type of situation, combined in this technologically savvy CEO who's trying a technological approach towards solving the world's problems, aka climate change.
Mm.
Who is this big tech billionaire in real life in bed
Mm.
with, uh, as we see it truthfully in our day-to-day political life, as we consider, especially today, who are the billionaires more likely to be in cahoots with?
What was interesting about that character is that whereas you could see the president being an analogy to Bush or Trump very
Mm,
clearly, with that character, it felt more like they smashed up a bunch of different like archetypes. So
mhm,
the tech CEO in the movie dresses like Steve Jobs,
mhm.
and also like he maybe has some issues with like paternity, or like a girl you see in the film, kind of like Steve Jobs had. So there's that. He kind of talks like maybe like a riff off of Elon Musk.
Yeah,
He is involved with phone technology, which is interesting because like the tech CEOs we think of today as being the most influential are like the Facebooks and Googles. But this guy seems like his company seems to control like a lot of different things. Like they basically have space technology where they can launch things into the space. And um, so he seemed like he was an amalgamation of a bunch of CEOs. And then when the weird part of it to me, like what you were just describing, was that it seemed like he was allied to the conservative political movement, which is the
yeah, a
opposite,
seventh
right,
rank
of what's
donor.
happening today.
Yeah, seventh rank
Right,
donor
like
or lobbyist, and he
right,
could at any point request and have a meeting with Meryl Streep's character. So that when I
yeah,
saw that scene where he just decided that he's going to meet with Meryl Streep on the spot, I realized that that couldn't happen anymore with the conservatives, with the
right,
Republican Party. The most it could potentially happen is the CEO of Exxon or something. Um,
right.
but nowhere else in technology in Silicon Valley, they don't even hold any sway with these folks anymore.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what they did. Is not only did they make the tech titan an amalgamation of all the tech people, even people with very different personalities and attributes,
Mhm.
but they also kind of combined them with the role that like fossil fuel companies play in the
Yeah.
Republican Party and made them into one thing, right?
Hmm.
Because yeah, the fossil fuel industry is very tied to the Republican Party structurally, and it would bleed into the analogy they're trying to make with climate change. Or the parties are not addressing climate change because fossil fuel companies
Hmm.
make money off of it, blah blah blah. And so yeah, they combine all those things together. But it might have been better if, let's say, they did have like a fossil fuel CEO be the one who wanted to, like, who wanted to actually profit off the comment, so on and so forth. It would have been more on the nose, but maybe it would have made a little more sense. Right now, the tech CEOs, if we compare the common emergency to the COVID emergency, I think the tech CEOs were very in step with the government and the public health people, right? They were trying to utilize their like content moderation to prohibit discussion about COVID in certain ways. At first, like it was even things like the lab leak theory were like somewhat down. I don't know if Facebook blocked it altogether, but they like did some kind of
They blocked
content
it.
moderation on it that was.
Yeah, they blocked the
Oh,
New
go
York
ahead.
Post article. They did a lot of things in the past COVID era since the
Mm,
COVID nation attacked. uh,
right.
they did a lot of stuff that could arguably be put on the Democratic side, that they were in one
Yeah, yeah.
party's
I mean,
camp.
the film kind of portrays the tech firm, the massive tech firm, as being on the conservative side of the question, whereas the
Yeah,
tech firms right now seem to be more allied to the Democrats. And the tech firms also were kind of serving as a stand-in for the fossil fuel companies in this analogy, but just because anyone who
mhm,
knows anything about the tech industry right now would have a hard time swallowing that, right? Like,
yeah.
I imagine the tech companies would all side with the scientific establishment and the government to do whatever they could about the comet, right? Like, I feel like they would be educating people about the comet. They would be maybe censoring or downplaying commentary from people who didn't think the comet was a big deal or something like that.
Yeah.
But they gave them
Comet
kind of the
denials.
reverse role, right? Yeah. Also, the film. Well, I don't want to spoil. I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't watched it. So
No, you
I
can spoil.
probably
We
shouldn't
already
get too.
said the disclaimer.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's right. Disclaimer. Okay. So I didn't mention this in my review, but like at one point in the movie, you have a rally of people, of the supporters of the president, and they have signs saying they want to mine the comet, right? It's like meaning that they want to extract the minerals or whatever that are on the comet, which I don't know enough about the science of this, but I think that might be technically impossible because I think comets are mostly ice anyway. But anyway, let's put that aside. But then the comet is, they can start to see it above them and they look up and then they start yelling at the president's son that they lied to them about the comet,
Yeah.
and I guess not existing. But that didn't even make any sense because the scene itself was full of the president's supporters who wanted to support mining the comet. So they obviously believe in the comet. But then the film is also like suggesting they didn't believe in the comet while also believing it at the same time. Because that's like where the title comes from. The title "Don't Look Up" comes from the conservative side of the debate, saying just don't look up and don't worry about the comet. It's not even there. But the
Which has no
conservatives at the exact same
basis.
time, like they want to extract all these minerals and like all this wealth
Yeah.
from the comet. So like it's almost like Sirota and McKay and the film, or whoever wrote the film, couldn't decide which critique they wanted to make, right? Did they want to make
So
the
they put
critique that
both of
people
them
just
in.
didn't believe in the comet, or
Yeah.
that they just thought they could profit off the comet, right? Because I think they
Yeah, I
should have picked
think
one or the other.
Yeah, I think they decided halfway through, because this movie was filmed during COVID. They decided halfway through, oh, you know what? Let's shove COVID in there as well and see if it works.
Hmm.
And I
I
don't think
think
it
a
did.
lot of people watching it did see it as a, because I think you're right. Like they were writing it before. I imagine they started like sketching this out or writing it before COVID started.
Yeah, they did.
They had they really wanted to stick to like the global warming stuff, but like as soon as this movie came out, a lot of people who were watching it were comparing it to COVID-19 like
Yeah.
immediately.
Hmm.
And it had to bear on like the producers of the film, right? In
Yeah.
terms of the polarization they saw around COVID-19 and trying to apply it to this issue as well. So because it is probably the closest emergency to the comet, in that it was like a large scale event that required a lot of people to change their lifestyles and like an
Hmm.
emergency response, um, which isn't quite the same thing with global warming, just because it's a very like slow burn type issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, I'd be curious to see if anyone's directly asked McKay or Sirota if they feel like how they incorporated that COVID situation into the film as well. But
You should do that on Twitter.
yeah, I
Yeah.
guess they're
Just
both
tweet
very
at them.
active on Twitter. Yeah, no, Sirota and McKay are both very active
Yeah,
on Twitter for
they've
sure.
both been actively defending the movie nonstop, which I admire.
Yeah,
Moving on to
sure.
quick
Yeah.
couple points. So there's a famous, or infamous rather, quote from AOC saying the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. How does that not force similarities and a mirroring almost of Jennifer Lawrence outbreak in the middle of the first or second part of half of the movie, where she's trying to get attention from the media folks on the TV show the Rip, but no one is taking her seriously. They're focusing on some celebrities' breakup. So how does that not force comparisons and give you an idea that, yeah, I mean, you can't really take someone seriously when they're telling you back in 2018 that the world is going to end in 2030, and some other people are going to decide to just ignore you all around because they're not seeing facts, they're not seeing anything that supports your views,
Right.
especially with the alarmism that is bestowed within your views.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this is like the characters in the movie seem to be addressing this issue the same way that like someone might address a political issue on Twitter, which, like, you know, like I think both McKay and Sirota do spend a lot of time on Twitter arguing about politics, which is sometimes that the way that you feel like you're winning is by expressing things in the most emotional terms, which Twitter rewards that. So you do kind of win Twitter by doing that. Like you get more retweets and likes and shares on Facebook, and all these social media websites reward that. But people who work in professional political advocacy generally don't do that, because it tends to look weird to people who are not like in those arenas or environments. So like Jennifer Lawrence and Leonardo DiCaprio's characters at different points have outbursts where they are screaming at television hosts, basically on a live cable show program, about the danger or threat of the comet, and everyone around them looks like you're just losing it, right? Because that is kind of the response you generally have when someone just has an outburst about something that you don't entirely understand or know about. But you know, they're kind of portrayed as being like somewhat noble because they did that, or maybe just like frustrated. But like the reality is, anyone who works on any kind of political issue and advocacy, and I've done advocacy work in the past, they're frustrated, right? That other people are not on the same page with them. That's why they're doing the advocacy work in the first place, because not everybody agrees with them, and they don't have the votes to pass whatever they want to do, or so on and so forth. The like devolving into shouting thing is like, it's just a sign that you are doing it wrong, or like you don't have the maturity to kind of see it through. And yet the movie kind of makes everyone else seem like in the wrong because they're not devolving into shouting, but like doesn't really help your cause in normal times. Of course, the way that everyone around them was responding to this comment was so absurd that maybe someone would lose their temper and shout that way. But it's not a very good analogy for how people should do like political advocacy. Towards the latter half of the movie, when they're like doing awareness stuff and holding concerts and rallies and stuff, like that's probably closer to normal. But at that point, all the other major actors in the film and government and the media have gotten so absurd that maybe that didn't make any difference. Although in real life, those are some of the tactics that are available to you in terms of addressing these issues. So I don't know. Some people who watched the movie, I was reading a lot of other reviews and responses to the movie. Some people who watched the movie thought that they were also making fun of Leo and Lawrence's characters for doing like the concert and the rallies and stuff. But, I thought about it, and I thought, what other choice did they have at that point? Right? Like
And the
only thing they could do.
Yeah, no, I think that was not, I don't think that part was a parody. I think that was an actual reflection on how things do tend to happen and how you sway folks onto your side. I just don't know how that reflects on their outbursts. I don't think positively. Right. Okay, last quick point here. So the performance of this movie is being touted everywhere as the most grossing movie in the history of Netflix, which is impressive. But people are, I think, malaligning the reasoning behind the success of this movie with its message and with the broader cause of climate change. I think there has to be a voice of reason telling people to slow down and reconsider the potential reasons for the success of this movie. I mean, after all, you have Leonardo DiCaprio, Meryl Streep, Jennifer Lawrence, Jonah Hill, Ariana Grande performing, and
Right.
many other folks like Adam McKay himself directing it and writing the script. So,
Mhm.
and Kate Blanchett, not to mention Tyler Perry as well. So why aren't people realizing that when folks hear about these names all together in the same movie, they don't miss out. They're not gonna choose not to watch this movie, even if they know the political messages behind it. So
Yeah, I mean, the movie definitely had a lot of star power. It also, I think, came out around the right time, right? Which is that it came out in the holidays. It was a streaming movie,
mhm,
had the star power, and also I think some of the non-political themes of the movie, like the family oriented stuff, like it's almost in some ways, even though it's like about a crazy, chaotic thing, um, it's just kind of an enjoyable and comfortable movie to watch in some ways. And
mhm,
also, even if you don't think that a lot of the criticisms of the media or of the political class make a whole lot of sense, they're still criticizing media and political class, which are like unpopular institutions, right? Like, I think I read some like conservative people who saw the movie who just liked seeing like the media, getting made fun of and stuff, right? Even though the movie was largely making fun of their like political side or their side of the aisle, right? So I think just picking those targets in particular, it's ripe for, I think it's the same reason people enjoy watching other satire like the Armando Iannucci stuff with Veep or Think of It, um, or any of the other big satirical things, because I think that the territory itself is very attractive.
yeah,
And yeah, I think the star power is attractive. And also I think a lot of people, even if they're with me and they didn't think that all the punches really landed, it's still an entertaining movie. Like it's still
I'd
like
say so.
the acting is enjoyable to watch, I
It's not
think, even though
Oscar
it's
worthy or anything, but it was certainly
right.
enjoyable.
I mean, it's overacted in the same way, like I said, like an improv
Yeah.
or a comedy skit would be, right?
Mhm.
It's not going to be something you're going to be remembering for years and years, but it's like, oh, you might laugh at parts of it, or you might remember parts of it, just for that reason. So, I know that there was, by the way, people do want to see like I think a little bit better satire of these same institutions. There's a really good movie called Thank You for Smoking. It came out, I think it
Yeah,
was
I've heard of
maybe
it.
2006 or 2007. Anyway, it's based off of Christopher Buckley's book, and Christopher Buckley is a really fun political satirist. He's the son of William Buckley, I think, who's a conservative. But Christopher is not like hardline conservative or anything. He's mostly just like he likes to write political comedy. And
Mhm.
anyway, the movie is about like a tobacco lobbyist in DC and sort of how he like manipulates politics and media to kind of drive the pro tobacco agenda. It's a little bit over the top too, but to me, it's a little bit more grounded in reality. And a lot of the ways that they describe them doing everything are pretty realistic to Washington. And you can kind of tell that somebody who's been enmeshed in that world, which like Buckley family has, was someone who wrote it. So I would definitely recommend if people enjoyed Don't Look Up just for the reasons of seeing a satire of media and politics. Um, Watch Thank You for Smoking. It's
Yeah.
really, really good. It has Aaron Eckhart and a few other people. I don't recall all their names, but Aaron Eckhart's the lead. He's a tobacco lobbyist.
Mhm. Cool. One last point here. I think if any messages should be taken from this movie is, as you said earlier, as you alluded to earlier, just get the sons and children of politicians out of politics. Just let's make sure we end nepotism with this movie. And with that thread, yeah, just get Chelsea Clinton out of it, get Hunter Biden out of politics, Ivanka and Jared Kushner. I think that's the
Right.
one message that I don't want to see Jonah Hill's character represented
Yeah,
in any political sense. I think that's something that
sure.
is very easily agreed upon by both bipartisan side. All
Yeah,
right.
and it's an inner well, not only is it intergenerational, but it's something that happens in other countries too, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the Bhuttos and the Gandhis, and like there's several families across the world where you have these kind of high level political party positions handed down through lineage. And I think honestly, I imagine that was one of the frustrations that led to Trump being elected was that
Mm-hmm.
Jeb Bush was basically in a position to be anointed, right? And that
Yeah,
would
it
have
was
been
a shoo-in.
the third
Mm-hmm.
Bush that would have been elected president. And I think he had over $100 million stacked up in super PACs and donors and blah, blah. And I think that there was a lot of frustration about that from some on the
Mm-hmm.
Republican side, and Trump tapped into it very effectively. So I think that's a real thing. It's funny that there's definitely some popular appeal to having those political dynasties or families. That's why these people stick around. But there's also like an equivalent frustration with it, right? That I
Yeah.
think leads to some of these dynasties losing and being toppled, and with both the Bushes and the Clintons in 2016, for instance. So,
Yeah, I mean, I know about dynasties. I come from the Middle East.
hmm.
um, Zed, I really appreciate this conversation. I really appreciate you going slightly over time here for the inaugural episode of What the Hekmat. This was What the Heck is wrong with Don't Look Up. I really appreciate our conversation. And do you want to quickly give a pitch to your Twitter handle and your Substack?
Yeah, I mean, I have a Twitter where I put a lot of my stuff out because I write for different places. It's just my first name, last name, so ZaidJilani. And also, I write a Substack newsletter with my friend Shant Misrobian. It's inquiremore.com. So you should check that out as well.
Excellent. I highly recommend following Zed. He's a unique writer in today's age. Thank you, Zed.
Thank you.